All right. Political geography. This is another subset of geography. Study of organization, distribution of political phenomena in a particular area. Organization, distribution of political phenomena. It's more than just red state, blue state. It's what's happening within these different areas. It's also looking at different countries, their forms of government. There's a lot of different things. A lot of political science goes into this. So, start off with the big ones. A state or a nation. Sometimes in international diplomacy, international history, a country we find to be referred to as a state. But the definition is an individual political unit holding sovereignty over a territory. Um, holding sovereign political unit holding sovereignty over a territory. Again, there's some different sub-definitions here. One is called a part nation state. Part nation state is where a nation is dispersed across, dominates two or more states. For example, the Arab states. There's 17 distinct countries in the Middle East and North Africa. But there are certain ideas and certain cultural cues they have in common: language, religion, nationalism. The kind of holds them together somewhat, even though they aren't distinct. They aren't a united political unit. The Arab states, for example. And then you have the idea of a stateless nation. Group of people without a country. Without a state of their own. The Kurds be an example of this. They're a distinct ethnic group that dominate portions of northwestern Iran, northern Iraq, and southeastern Turkey. But they do not have their own country. Gypsies are an example of a stateless nation. They're an ethnic minority, very commonly seen in southeastern Europe, but they don't have a distinct country of their own. Or the Basques of northern Spain. Been a movement by the Basques to push for independence for off and on for years. But they consider themselves to be a people without a country, even though they are Spanish citizens. They really don't consider themselves to be part of Spain. And the idea of nation state as a state where a territorial extent coincides with a distinct community. Particularly it is a political unit with a defined territory, but large enough that it coincides with a distinct community. Now, it's different from colonies or protectorates. A protectorate, it's basically a country that's independent but has to do what some other country says. Independence exists only in name only. For practical reasons, they don't have control over their own territory. Um, they're not considered nation states because they don't have full control over the territory. Colonies the same way. A big old area with a lot of people, but they are not an independent nation. They don't have control. They have to answer to the home country. The United States, before the American Revolution, as a colony, we were not a nation state because we didn't have control over our own territory. Like I say, we elected local legislators and everything. We took care of a lot of our own local business, but most of the decisions were being made in London, not in America. So we didn't have our own full control over it. Then you have a binational or a multinational state. This is a case where you have more than one more than one nation. No sizable group dominates the population. Canada being an example of this. You have the French Canadians living in Quebec. The rest of the country is mostly of English descent. But keep a cohesive nation together. They work together. They basically allow these different nations to exist within Canada. The English nation, the French nation, and then the Native American nations. The part nation state, you have a nationality spread across more than one nation. The Arab nations, again, that's an example of this, spread across North Africa. Or Germany before it was unified. Before German unification, say, go back to 1815, there were 38 distinct countries in the area that would become Germany. All unified by a common German culture and a German language, but they're separated by different political entities. Different countries, their own rules, own laws, own governments. But all these are distinct nation states recognized as distinct nation states. In another sense, they're a part nation state because they're part of a larger ethnic community of the Germans. Now, the 18th century political philosophers giving ideological cohesion, the idea that people had allegiance to a state and a people rather than to a ruler. This idea of nationalism starts coming in. Because, for example, in France, you aren't French just because you're living in an area where everybody has the same king. Everyone is subject to the same government. I said, no, being French was more than that. Being French was more than just being a subject of the Bourbon monarchy. Being French was the language, the culture, the history, the heritage, religious beliefs. That's what made people French. And while it was a more democratic idea of uniting a people, there's simply more than just ties of government, but ties of culture. But of course, the problem any idea is taken too much extreme. Sometimes nationalism is used to not just a way of unifying a people or a friendly rivalry with a neighbor. No, it's I guess sometimes in extreme situations gets the idea that you're better than everyone else. You're especially better than your neighbors. So much better than you get to take over their territory. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an example of that extreme nationalism. Decided that Ukraine's not a real country, it's not as good as Russia, so we deserve to go in and take over it. And now, 450,000 dead later, they're still trying to stick to that idea and really haven't made any kind of progress in the last year. In 1776, there are 35 empires, kingdoms, and nations worldwide. By 1939, there's 70. There's so many more because all these different countries in Europe came independent after World War One. The nation states of North and South America, they gained their independence from England, Spain, and France. We don't have quite as many countries because most of Africa is still under colonial rule. But you have a lot more of what you had in 1776. 2003, you're up to 191. All these different peoples are moving to decide their own fates for themselves, to define their own communities, to set up their own governments, and make their own direction for their communities. And you see a lot of this because of the breakup of the colonial systems, the breakup of the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, created 20 nations out of the breakup of 3 countries. Size of the country varies. Russia, of course, is the largest country in the world, 17 million square kilometers. Takes up 12 time zones. Russia being the largest country in the world, Canada being second, the United States third. China close fourth. In terms of population, it's India's the most populous nation, then China, then the United States. Ranking 3 in terms of size and population. Interestingly enough, Russia, 17 million square kilometers, it's 1 million times the size of the smallest country in the world, state of Nauru, which is just 21 square kilometers. Tiny little island out in the Pacific. It's its own country, though. Russia takes up 11% of the land surface on the planet. And there are a lot of different shapes also. This is another important idea about political geography is how boundaries are created. And also why they're created. I see maps around the room here, what they call political maps. They show the not just indicating natural features, but also showing the political divisions between one government and another. For example, this would just be a physical map, but this one here, this is a political map. Sometimes it just has the borders, not the features. But a political map is one that shows the different borders and everything. They come from all sorts of shapes and sizes. Like I said, there are reasons for that. Borders exist usually through international agreements. You and your neighbors get together and decide, okay, what's the border going to be? What's the end of our territory and the beginning of yours? There are reasons for that. Because they happen to an army happens to occupy an area or certain resources they want. Uh, Certain ethnic groups living in a certain area. But borders are defined in many different ways. It can be defined by the edge of a body of water, um, like a lake or an ocean or a river. Rivers make very good boundaries. But of course, the idea of these tiny little Pacific Island countries, yeah, their borders are defined by the ocean, physical land, and then the ocean. That's it. Mountain ranges sometimes are boundaries. And of course, the problem though with things like mountain ranges and rivers as boundaries is if you're defining a border based on, say, a glacier on a mountain, what happens is that glacier expands and contracts. That's actually a problem that Italy had with Switzerland the past few years. That the edge of this glacier was retreating because of global warming. So it meant that Italy was expanding and Switzerland was shrinking. So they had to try to find some way to make uh, some kind of a friendly arrangement between each other. Sometimes you have areas that are so remote and inaccessible that no one really claims it. Example, between Turkey and Greece in the Aegean Sea, there are a lot of tiny little islands. It's a little more than just rocks breaking above the surface of the water. It's kind of hard to define who owns what. Um, Canada and Denmark actually have this issue. There's this tiny little island off eastern Canada between Greenland and Canada that is claimed by both Canada and Denmark. Now, it's an uninhabited rock. There are no natural resources. There's no natural water supplies. It's not big enough for any kind of port or anything. But uh, they can't figure out who should own it. And so, since they're both friends and both allies, what they do, they make a joke out of it. Every so often, a Danish army unit will come in and train on this island. They will put the Danish flag up and a bottle of Danish schnapps next to it. And then they leave. No reason to stay, no way they could stay. And so, what do the Canadians do? Um, well, a few weeks, a few months later, they send their army in for maneuvers. They take down the Danish flag, put up the Canadian flag. They share the Danish schnapps with themselves and leave a bottle of Canadian whiskey. Like I said, just as lighthearted and uncontroversial as it can be. Just no point in just going to all the trouble trying to find or figure out who owns it. Because neither one of them really wants it. And really, that's about the most Canadian and most Danish story you can get out of modern politics. Next, disputes between countries don't have to lead to a lot of tensions. They don't have to cause problems, and they can be amicably solved. Rivers as boundaries. Well, rivers shift around a little bit. Um, the Red River is the boundary between Texas and Oklahoma. What's happened over many years and decades is because of the Coriolis effect, the Red River has shifted slightly to the southeast, which means that the border as was originally created is not quite the same border anymore. So it was Texas and Oklahoma actually had to take this all the way to court to try to figure this out. Who actually owns this territory? Because in this case, these are inhabited areas. Uh, Farmers and ranchers, they have all these lands up against the Red River, and the counties, municipalities, their tax revenue comes from how much land is available there. What kind of land is being, how much land does someone own within, say, Oklahoma or within Texas? So yeah, it comes down to these municipalities, down to their budget, what kind of money they have. So eventually, they broke it down. They decided that the border will be the south vegetation line of the Red River. That is, once where the grass stops and all the gravel begins going into the Red River, that's Oklahoma. Where the grass starts, that's Texas. Now, within countries, that's easy to solve and easy to figure out, but between different countries, that can be far more complicated. So, different types of boundaries. We talk about here natural boundaries. And distinct, something you can see. Mountains and rivers and such. It's also called a physical boundary. Artificial boundaries, called geometric boundaries. Each determined by lines of latitude and longitude. We see these straight boundaries, particularly between states, between countries. That is an example of an artificial boundary. Just an imaginary line that exists only on paper. Again, the border between Canada and the United States, that is an artificial boundary. It's based on a specific line of latitude. But you go up to the Canadian-American border, you're not going to see some big line there across on the ground separating the United States from Canada. Not going to see anything. Just if it weren't for, say, for a fence or some border crossing posts, you wouldn't even know you'd moved from one country into another because the line exists only on paper. But as an agreement the United States and Canada made with each other, this is going to be the boundary, an artificial one. An antecedent boundary. This is drawn across an area before it becomes very well populated. For example, the development of the American West. The borders had to be drawn between the United States and France, and between the United States and Spain and Mexico. Because, aside from the Native American tribes, there weren't a lot of people living in the American Southwest. The U.S. took possession of the American Southwest after the Mexican War. There weren't a lot of people, aside from the tribes, living west of the Mississippi River when the United States bought Louisiana. So what you had there was an antecedent boundary. Then the subsequent boundary drawn after the development of a cultural landscape. Specifically, most common kind of border here be the creation of an ethnic state. Because when you have a fair number of a group of people in there, they try to. The tendency was to try to create boundaries that connected and kept all group of particular people within the same country. For example, the creation of, say, Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary after World War I. Those are drawn as subsequent boundaries. Again, trying to keep particular ethnic groups together after a cultural landscape had been established. And that is related to a consequent or an ethnographic boundary drawn for those ethnic reasons, to keep those ethnic communities together. And the idea that people of a particular group will want to stay together in a particular group in a community and make their own decisions as a community. Self-determination. A superimposed boundary. Superimposed boundary is forced upon existing cultural landscapes in a way that doesn't take care to preserve these ethnic groups. For example, colonial Africa. Borders of most modern African countries are based on old administrative division lines of the colonial powers. And those borders are designed for ease of administration, not designed to keep communities together. It was imposed on these areas, and so it ended up dividing communities. So those boundaries have been causing a lot of problems largely since independence. So, resources, minority group identification, water bodies, there's access to sea and water sources. Those can cause conflicts over boundaries. Now, think about minority groups as far as conflict is, especially in times of a lot of warfare or famine or something else, a large group of people will move from one area to another. So it's hard to draw an exact ethnic boundary because those groups aren't always staying together and aren't always staying in one particular area. So their areas of influence will expand or contract. Access to water sources. That's a big thing because clean water is very scarce in a lot of areas of the world. You need water to survive, and there are a lot of people fighting over that. Some people want access to ports so they can have access to international trade. If they don't do that, then sometimes they will be willing to go to war with each other over it. So, the idea is centripetal and centrifugal forces. Centripetal forces are those used to try to promote unity and stability in a nation. This try to pull together. Schools, and armed forces, religion, national teams, certain traditions common to all. Those are centripetal forces, things that pull people together. Centrifugal forces are used to divide and destabilize a nation. It is push apart. And this can also be religion. It can be nationalism that is directed against a particular group. Separatist groups, regionalism, and so forth. Now, it's nationalism, we talked about earlier. Um, Generally, you have an identification with the state and acceptance of national goals. We also have the idea of supranationalism. Associations of three or more countries created for the mutual benefit and the achievement of shared objectives. Association of nations for a common benefit. Examples of associations formed under the idea of supranationalism, the European Union. Most countries in Europe are united into one common market. No tariffs, free trade across borders, a common currency, common economic planning. That's an idea of supranationalism. The United Nations. The nations of the world working together to try to maintain peace and try to prevent disasters such as famine and disease. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association. That's an idea of supranationalism. The free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. NATO is an example of this, a defensive alliance. All the nations of NATO, all 32 of them, from Finland to Greece to the U.S. and Canada, all working towards a common goal of maintaining peace, stability, and democracy. Not for the domination of one group within this alliance, but for the benefit of all of them. Okay. So, keep reading books, chapters 7 and 8. Talk about economic geography a little bit more next time. Any questions on anything? All right. We'll call it a day.